So, picture this. You're out on a hike, you're enjoying the day, and then you get home and you just feel a little off. A few days go by, and bam, you're hit with a fever and a headache that just won't quit. Now you're probably thinking, it's just the flu, I can just tough it out. But what if it's something else? Something hiding in plain sight, delivered by one of nature's tiniest and sneakiest couriers.
Yeah, sounds familiar, right? You feel sick, the symptoms are kind of vague, and your first thought is just some common bug. It is so easy to dismiss, but these really non-specific signs, they can be a total smokescreen for a much more serious intruder. So what else could possibly be going on?
Okay, let's break it down. You're hit with a sudden fever, you've got chills that are just racking your body, and a severe headache that makes it hard to even think straight. On top of that, your muscles ache all over and you just have this general feeling of being completely unwell, what doctors call malaise. It feels exactly like a bad case of the flu, but it's not. And because these symptoms are so incredibly familiar, the real culprit is dangerously easy to miss.
So let's start our investigation right here. We've got these super general, flu-like symptoms, but how common is the illness that's actually causing them? Well, the answer is a little complicated.
You know, the best way to think about this illness is like an iceberg. The cases that get reported, the ones where people get sick enough to actually go to a doctor, that's just the tip. What this really means is that the vast majority of infections are probably subclinical, happening completely hidden beneath the surface. These are all the people who get infected but have such mild symptoms, or maybe no symptoms at all, that their case just never gets counted. This makes it a really widespread but largely invisible threat.
Okay, so what is this mystery illness then? Well, it's not a virus like the flu. The culprit is actually a tiny bacterium, and it gets around using a very familiar and very unwelcome getaway driver. Meet Anaplasmosis. Yeah, that's a mouthful, I know. This is the tiny bug that causes anaplasmosis. And here's what makes it so sneaky. It's intracellular. That means it doesn't just float around in your bloodstream. No, it actually burrows its way inside your body's own cells, where it can hide out from your immune system. It's like a home invader at the cellular level.
And how does this little home invader get inside? Well, it catches a ride. Its accomplice is the Ixodes tick. You've probably heard of them. They're better known as deer ticks or black-legged ticks. Yep, the very same tiny creatures that are famous for spreading Lyme disease are also the primary taxi service for this bacterium.
Now this is where it gets really eye-opening. This isn't some rare, obscure disease anymore. Just look at the trend. In the year 2000, there were just 346 reported cases in the US. Fast forward just 10 years to 2010, and that number skyrockets to over 1,700. That's not just a little blip. It is a crystal clear sign that this thing is on the rise.
And that trend? It just kept climbing. By 2016, the CDC was reporting over 4,000 cases. This is a clear signal that anaplasmosis is an emerging and growing public health concern, especially in certain parts of the country.
So how does this all work? Well, you can think of it as a chain reaction in nature. The bacteria lives inside animal hosts, like the white-footed mouse or deer. They act as the reservoir. Then, the ticks, our vectors, come along and pick up the bacteria when they feed on those infected animals. And then, of course, when one of those ticks bites a human, they pass the bacteria right on to us.
So let's get to the really crucial part. What happens after the tick bite? Well, once that bacteria gets past your skin, it begins this really fascinating and, frankly, devious invasion at the cellular level.
Okay, that sounds super technical, right? But let me translate. What this is basically saying describes an incredible act of biological warfare. The bacteria doesn't just attack your cells. It turns your own immune cells, your white blood cells, into its personal hiding spots and breeding grounds. It literally invades the very cells that are supposed to be protecting you and uses them to make more of itself.
We can think of it as a four-step cellular heist. First, the transmission. The tick bites you. Step 2, invasion. The bacteria zeroes in on your white blood cells, specifically your neutrophils. Step 3, the hijack. It gets inside and completely disables the cell's ability to fight back. And finally, step 4, the damage. Your own immune system realizes something is terribly wrong and just goes into overdrive, unleashing this massive inflammatory response. And it's that friendly fire from your own body that actually causes the fever, the aches, and all the symptoms.
So, let's move on to how doctors actually solve this case and fight back. Because even though this bacterium is pretty clever, it does leave behind clues, and thankfully, we have some very effective ways to stop it in its tracks.
So how do doctors figure out if you have anaplasmosis?
Well, they have a few different tools in their detective kit. They can use a really sensitive PCR test to look for the bacteria's actual DNA in your blood, or they can look at a blood sample under a microscope to spot these telltale little clusters of bacteria called merula hiding inside your immune cells. And finally, they can use blood tests to see if your immune system is cranking out antibodies specifically to fight off this infection.
Now, here is a really important point of clarification. You're probably thinking, wait, this sounds a lot like Lyme disease. And you're right, they're both carried by the same tick. But here is the key difference. A rash is very uncommon in anaplasmosis. With Lyme, you often get that classic bullseye rash. The absence of a rash is actually a major clue for doctors, and that distinction is absolutely vital for getting the right diagnosis.
Okay, so after all that, here is the good news. We can treat this. The antibiotic doxycycline is incredibly effective at killing the bacteria. For most people, a course of treatment leads to a full recovery. But, and this is a big but, it is so important to start that treatment as soon as possible. Getting ahead of it is the key to preventing the infection from turning into something much more serious.
Now that we get the threat, the culprit, and the cure, let's cover what is honestly the most important part, the practical, real-world steps you can take to make sure this never happens to you in the first place.
Your best defense is a good offense. This is your prevention toolkit. It all starts with trying to avoid tick bites, especially if you're in areas where they're common, like the Northeast or Upper Midwest. Use a good insect repellent like DEET. Wear light-colored clothes. It makes it way easier to spot a tick that's crawling on you. And always do a thorough tick check of your skin, your hair, and your clothes after you've been outside.
And that last point, the tick check, is absolutely critical. Here's why. Unlike some other diseases, the transmission of this bacteria isn't instantaneous. The tick generally has to be attached to you for at least 4 to 24 hours to pass it on. This gives you a critical window of opportunity. If you find and remove that tick quickly and properly, you can dramatically reduce your risk of ever getting sick.
In the end, it's just a powerful reminder, isn't it? Sometimes the most significant threats really do come in the smallest packages. Anaplasmosis is a master of disguise. It mimics common illnesses while hiding the potential for serious harm. But with a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of vigilance, we can solve the mystery before it ever becomes a crisis. So the real question is, are you prepared for your next outdoor adventure?